Well, hi everyone. Thanks so much for having me here. I very much appreciate the opportunity, and I appreciate also the patience of the organizers of this event. This is, I think, our third time trying to get up here. It's been quite a hectic year for us. Hectic in all of the best ways. We've got a little two-year-old kid squid, I call him, and our beloved best friend. He is with my wife next door in story time. And I would just first off and foremost like to say that of the 7 books that I have done, it's really the books that we have done. As we all know, we are partners in our lives with someone, if we are so fortunate. And I, not only in all things life, but all things professional, my wife is the graphic designer for all of our books. And so it is I who am standing in front of you today, but it is really she and our work together that I am representing, and that she is minding our kid squid allows me to be here. So I just wanted to say thank you to her for that, especially. So, and to acknowledge her. So I've had a sort of a very non-linear career trajectory, some of which was mentioned. Thank you for the very kind introduction. I started off, I grew up in a very multi-ethnic neighborhood in Washington, D.C., a neighborhood called Mount Pleasant. And it was a very, very interesting neighborhood because it was largely populated, well, after the '68 riots, which were basically the epicenter of, were right in my neighborhood. After that, white flight, black flight, everybody flight, there was nobody in this neighborhood. And through the years, though, it began to be populated by ethnic communities, immigrant populations coming to America. And a lot of these were Eritrean, Ethiopian, Guatemalan, Honduran, Salvadorian. Communities fleeing civil unrest in their countries. And so there was very much a refugee population here, but also a lot of embassy workers, a lot of international students. There was an incredible international community here, all of whom were in DC for various reasons. Some of them to escape, some of whom to really acquire their new lives. And all of them brought with them their food, because that's what they use to identify most themselves, their communities, their cultures, and what they were bringing from their old world to their new world. And it was just a beautiful display of everything that's great about humanity. And the ability for me to understand how food was an exploration of culture from a very early age really stuck with me and has really driven everything that I've done in my career. Going over to Jose's house to make roll the masa and press the tortillas, or going over to Arinfa's house to make the Eritrean stews and to use the teff flour and all this, and just understanding that food is diverse. Food is a means by which we define ourselves, but food is also a complete and total universal fluency. And it is that fluency that I have always looked to understand the world through. Food is also something that represents a physical exploration of our world. And we literally import the world from all corners of it onto our plates in a globalized economy, and especially with seafood, which has become my particular focus. Seafood is the most globally traded commodity of all commodities on this planet. It comes from every place onto our plates. And the complexity and lack of transparency in that system is astounding. And it's something that I think really deserves to be unpacked. And I will try and do a little bit of that today and speak to the importance of seafood as part of our future, and really as a tool that we can use as consumers and as citizens, as neighbors, to improve and empower our communities. And that is especially important here in coastal Maine, of course, but as I will endeavor to show you, that this is a much broader opportunity that we have as coastal citizens to impact and empower the lives of everyone that we live with. So, I came up, hi, welcome. I also had a great opportunity when I was a young child to spend some of my summers down on the Patuxent River, the tributary of the Chesapeake Bay. I was born and raised during the era of Marion Barry, if anybody remembers that great politician in the canons of American history, right at the height of the crack epidemic in Washington, D.C. And so my parents had the very good idea to get me out of there. And But there I spent my summers in the quest for food. And I would cast from my line. Every third cast would come back with it: a perch, a porgy, a ray, a croaker, a striped bass, a bluefish, a spot, I mean, you name it. There was bounty in those waters, and that became my baseline. That's what I understood the environment to yield. I would wade through the eelgrass, avoiding water moccasins in search of the peeler crabs, the blue crabs, the beautiful soft shells, and just, this was my world. I was a little Yule Gibbons, and I looked at the world and said, what does that taste like? And that was the way that I saw the world, and that hasn't stopped. I'm quite fortunate now to live in Maine, because the world around us is pretty delicious. But when I had the opportunity to first become an executive chef, I was 24 years old, and it was the first time I had opportunity to write my own menu. And a menu is a very personal narrative. It's a very personal document about who I am, my baselines, my experiences, what I want to share with you about my life. And think about what happens when you invite somebody over for dinner. Are you just some haphazard recipe, or is it something that's really interesting to you for a reason that it speaks to your heritage, a recipe from your family, something about you? You're putting yourself on display in a large way. And menus do that to an exponent factor, because they're so broad. And so I called up, for my first menu, I called up my fish purveyor and I said, hey, I want bluefish, I want oysters, I want blue crabs, I want striped bass, I want the bounty of my child, I want my baseline, I want to share with my customers this. And the guy on the other end of the line literally said to me, hey kid, what are you talking about? We ate all of those, what else do you want? And I realized that right then and there, the guiding hand of natural selection in our world is quite firmly holding a fork. And the way that we eat largely describes how this world is used. And so I became very much interested in sustainable foods, understanding how we impact ecosystems through the choices that we make for dinner. And a lot of that narrative, a lot of the environmental narrative in our communities and our society is very negative. It's very bad human bad. It's very much placing the blame on us as the negative force. Because, well, ultimately we are the actors, correct? And so I looked around and I saw that the choices that we make, the fact that chefs were putting bluefin tuna and Chilean sea bass and orange roughy on menus, and almost just extirpating these species simply through our demand. I'm looking around and seeing that the Western diet and the foods and the diets promoted by chefs largely are literally killing Americans. Top 5 causes of death are lifestyle-related diseases, most of them related to food. So I'm looking around and I'm seeing that we're destroying environments and we are harming ourselves through the choices we're making for dinner. Whoa! This is that guilty narrative. But I choose to see the other side of that coin. Because the optimism of this is that if by the choices we make for dinner we can heal, we can harm, and we can hurt, then by those very same choices we can heal and we can restore. And so I began to look at environmentalism not as a do no harm approach, but rather as a do more good. And so looking at sustainability as a tool to improve the lives of people. Now, I had opportunity to step away from restaurants on top and to follow my pursuit, my passion for sustainability. And I had a pretty sexy job offer. I was an explorer for the National Geographic Society. And think about what that means. Well, actually it just means go somewhere, do something under the halo of this beautiful golden rectangle, and then come back and tell somebody about it, right? I mean, it's like, that's pretty cool. And guess what? I mean, everyone in the world has a story to tell, and they all trust National Geographic, the most trusted brand in the world, and it's just the access given to this. And so I went out into the world with the idea that I was going to, conservation was my purpose, that I was going to go save the oceans. I was going to go minimize the impact that we have on our ocean ecosystems. And through various experiences, I lived and worked as a fisherman in Africa. I worked with the West African Trade Hub in Senegal and the Gambia. I spent some significant time in Spain, all over the Mediterranean. Living and working and traveling all over the world, I very quickly began to realize that our purpose in sustainability is not to minimize the impact we have on ecosystems, but rather to maximize the impact they have upon us. And that the ultimate measure of sustainability is the endurance of thriving humans. thriving humans are the product of resilient ecosystems. But if we make the environment our purpose, then we fail to address the true drivers and the motivators of our behaviors. And the ultimate purpose is for us to endure and to thrive as humans. And so with that, I had the opportunity to look at what are the measures of thriving humans? Well, public health. And so I had an opportunity to create a job for myself at Harvard with the Center for Health and Global Environment, looking at the macro impacts of seafood consumption. Sure, there are the micro impacts of nutrition, of how it affects us when we ingest it, but let's look at the decision process by which seafood comes onto our plates or into our lives, or is as part of a community. Let's look at climate change. Let's look at job creation. Let's look at women's empowerment. Let's look at coastal communities and access to resources. Let's look at public health through a macro lens. And how does seafood fit into that? And as I did my research, as I did my further understood how to address and to achieve the endurance of thriving human communities, it became my understanding that seafood itself is the tool by which humans will thrive. And it is my goal now in my career to get more people eating more seafood across all demographics. That is my purpose. And that might be seemingly at odds with sustainable seafood just on its surface, but I'll tell you why I want to get more people eating more seafood. First of all, in America, and I'll focus my narrative mostly on America, and then we can talk about sort of a global perspective a little bit later, but to the most recent book, American Seafood, we'll stay on topic there. In America, seafood is our heritage. It was cod upon the backs of which we took our first steps towards economic and political freedom. This country was founded upon the economy of cod. Sure, we might have come here in the mythology of religious freedom, but we actually came here to fish cod and had been doing so for hundreds of years prior to Plymouth. This was our purpose here. It was the economy of cod. There was more wealth mined from the North Atlantic from the finned fish of cod than ever was mined in gold from South America. Think about what golds from South America did for the Spanish Empire. Cod did for the American Empire. We are the product of cod, and then of cotton, and then of other industries as we turned inward. Cod is our heritage. Fisheries are why we are here. So it is only right that I think that we admire that we celebrate that, we genuflect to that history and understand its role. We are a country of pageantry. We love our heritage and celebrate it, but we don't much celebrate our coastal communities. So I want to get more people eating more seafood for that reason, simply to connect us to our past, to understand the continuity that we should be supporting. From an environmental perspective, I would like you to be eating more seafood because seafood is a sustainable animal protein. Sure, within seafood there are unsustainable species and more sustainable species. But what is seafood in America? It's a center of the plate decision. So let's treat it as that and treat it and look at it as a protein. When we in America decide what's for dinner, we are thinking about the center of the plate and we are thinking about animal protein. Maybe not everyone in this room, but to the vast, vast extent, that's what Americans do. So beef, pork, chicken, lamb, veal, turkey, and seafood. We need to be thinking about it in that context. Well, let's look at it now against 5 environmental metrics. Antibiotic use. Seafood comes in better than all land animal proteins. Freshwater usage. Seafood is a fraction of the freshwater use of land animal protein production. Greenhouse gas emissions, decimal dust fraction of the greenhouse gas emissions of land animal protein creation. Land use alterations, in terms of how much land do we need to create, how much forest do we need to cut down to create seafood? 0. And feed conversion ratio. How much food do we need to feed to an animal in order to get food out of it? Well, with seafood, very, very little. With cattle, you're talking an order of 16 pounds to 1. 20 pounds to 1. Chicken, you're talking about 2 pounds to 1. Other animals in between. Seafood, wild seafood, you're talking about 0. You're talking about natural systems. When with aquaculture, you're talking about systems that are advancing rapidly and are now basically at 1.1 pounds in to 1.1 pound out, or to 1 pound out. So you're looking at a protein that is biologically exponentially more efficient. You and I are right now spending an awful lot of energy maintaining our body temperatures. You and I are also spending a lot of energy fighting gravity. We put a lot of calories and effort into growing bones. 14 to 20% of our bodies and that of land animal proteins are connective tissue to hold those bones and muscles together to fight gravity. I'm a fish, man. I'm just floating here. Buoyancy, isn't it great? And I don't have to regulate my temperature. 3% of fish to 5% of fish is connective tissue. Just think about that in terms of the efficiency of this system. These are more efficient animals. And when it comes to just the maximum opportunity, 99% of the livable space on this planet happens to be in the ocean. 99%. I can grow something on land so far as I can root it to it. The ocean, as a 3D environment, I can grow something in an awful lot. 99% of the livable space on this planet is in the ocean. 71% of its surface is in the ocean. We call it planet Earth, but it really should be called planet water. And that's just environmental perspective, it is a more efficient protein. Sure, we should be eating a lot more vegetables, grains, pulses, greens, and all of that, but bottom line is when we decide what's for dinner, we need to be thinking seafood from a sustainability perspective first, and then describing which seafood is more sustainable within it. And finally, from a health perspective, we need to be eating more seafood desperately, to the point where it is an epidemic in America. The #1 cause of death in America is heart disease. The top 5 causes of death in America are all diet-related or lifestyle-related illnesses. Seafood and omega-3s are such an important part of our ability to fight and combat heart disease that a study by my colleague Dr. Dariush Mozaffarian, who was at Harvard, he's now the dean of the Friedman School of Nutrition at Tufts, he did a study in which eating seafood rich in omega-3s just twice a week, as our government recommends, it's eating seafood twice a week, reduces incidences of cardiac mortality by 36%. If you extrapolate that number out, that is 55,000 American lives per year saved simply by eating seafood twice a week. You add into that mental health benefits, cognitive benefits, you add into that decreased blood pressure and a host of other benefits associated with not eating other proteins, which are over-present in our diet. Seafood is so important to eat that the 3 S's of public health are don't smoke, wear your seatbelt, and eat seafood. It is literally that important to our health. And yet in America, 7% of our population eats seafood twice a week. 7%. #1 cause of death in America can be reduced by 36% simply by following these recommendations. This is an epidemic, and it's one that's solvable, just like smoking and just like wearing seatbelts. We need to be talking about that. So from these perspectives, this is why I want more people eating more seafood. It's better for our planet, it is better for us, and it celebrates something that is very important in our culture, in our future as well. But we don't really have a narrative about seafood, and that's what American seafood is all about. When I ask you to think about a farmer's market, when I ask you to think about a farm, we have a vision of it, right? We understand why we wake up on Sunday mornings and spend something called cash. I'm not sure if you've heard of that recently. But you go somewhere and you actually spend something to engage with the community. And you understand the purpose of the small American family farm. We understand that it is literally woven into the fabric of our nation's identity. I ask you to close your eyes and picture a farm. undulating hills fading off into autumn's splendor-setting sun, perfectly patterned rows of corn, pleasantly leading the eye towards that white barn, or that white house, paint chipping, rocking chair on the porch, that red barn, paint fading, in this vision of romantic Americana. We get it. We get it so much to the point that we sing about it. For amber waves of grain, the fruited plain. But if I ask most Americans to picture a fishery, close your eyes, outside of very specific areas like Maine, people just look at me funny. And they might close their eyes and they're standing on a dock and they're gazing wistfully out at the wine dark sea, thinking as though a fishery is something that happens somewhere else. It happens in a place other than us, beyond the horizon of our attentions. But to understand a fishery, you stand on that dock, but you turn around and you see this. My town in South Freeport. You see Krista Tripp following in 5 generations of bootsteps to take helm of a lobster boat, just like her great-great-great-granddaddy did up in Rockland. You begin to see that a fishery is the sum of the labors and the aspirations of the community. It is the mortgages and the public schools, the quality of education, the opportunity for sons and daughters to stay within a community, to stay rooted in a nuclear family. It is the opportunity for us to maintain our heritage. And when we understand a fishery to be such, we understand a fishery to be ourselves, to be our own motivations, to be that American iconography. And that is what is so important about fisheries, and what we need to celebrate, and why I wrote American Seafood. It is a narrative history, an anthropological and culinary exploration of fisheries, all the way from Roger Williams translating the Algonquin Indian language, John Smith and his travels through the Chesapeake and north. It is an exploration of how we have utilized seafood and how it has become part of our nation from our very foundings. Through it, there are narrative essays, but there is also a very important visual essay. We look at images like this, Winslow Homer. And this is a very iconic painting, right? We understand this. But if I was to ask you, quick, come up with an iconic American image, this is not the one you'd probably come up with, but we certainly understand it. And when we travel through New England towns, coastal towns, the country over, we begin to see memorials that look a lot like war memorials, that celebrate the lives and contributions of the nearly 2,400 men that went down to the sea in ships and went down, unfortunately, in Gloucester. We understand that this was a noble profession, something to be celebrated. We understand it to be multi-generational. We understand it to be the opportunity for man and women to work that water, to work their heritage. We all remember victory gardens. We celebrate that as our contribution on the home front to win the war, send the meat overseas, feed ourselves at home, but wow, fish actually was the majority of the protein that we sent overseas. It was written in a government pamphlet that cans of sardines did as much to win the war as did their larger brethren, meaning submarines. Cans in which we packed men, well, cans in which we packed fish were just as important. This is part of our history. We should celebrate it. And when we think about heroicism, we think about a guy like Pete Garrica. This is right down off the backside of the Levy-on-Pontchartrain, down New Orleans way. After Katrina, when that levee broke, he and his wife spent 4 days clinging to the top of a light post, holding on for dear life. And dear life they saved. That shrimp boat, though, well, the shrimp boat didn't get saved. A month later, though, he had a new boat, and he was right back on the water. Because why would he do anything else than to do what his great-granddaddy did? And that's heroicism. That is heroics. And when we think of fishing, we think of it and we understand it to be the most dangerous profession in America, that and logging. We understand that this is something that men and women sacrifice for. And just as we nobly laud farmers for putting food on our tables, so too must we laud this. We understand that throughout our history, seafood has been a big part of it. That we used to celebrate seafoods like mackerel. They used to be the most popular and most abundant seafoods of all of the things on our menus. That it was such a huge part of our culture, of our culinary, especially here in New England. And that we've really lost a lot of these flavors to history. And ultimately we understand that a fishery is something that we can relate to on eventide, on a New England November's day. This is something that attracts us. Isn't this why we live here? Because we can associate ourselves with something so beautiful. So in fisheries, though, we have a responsibility to diversify. And that's another reason why I wrote this book. Not only do we need to connect to the fishermen and women, the people who are producing food for us, we need to connect to the products that they are actually producing. So American seafood, it says 500 species on the cover. It's actually over 750 species in all that are documented in the book. And those are just the species that are caught in America alone. However, in America, we eat 15 pounds per person of seafood per year. Of that, 95% of it is only 10 species. 65% of that 15 pounds is only 3 species, shrimp, tuna, and salmon. So of this wild abundance, an incredible diversity that represents everything we love about America, we have reduced that down to basically 3 species, shrimp, tuna, and salmon. And the other 7 species, well, they're basically whitefish. It's pollock, and tilapia, and catfish, and swai, and basa, and pangasius, and basically forms of catfish. Basically, they're all flaky white flesh fish. That's what we eat. So it could basically be said we eat 4 types of seafood, and that's it. And what that's done is it's created an incredibly irrational economy. And this is where unsustainability has become our creation. When a net is dragged through the water, what comes up with it? Well, a slice of the ocean. But when we go to a fish market, what are we willing to buy? Cod. That's it. Or salmon. That's it. Or shrimp. But what comes up in that net? Cod, and pollock, and haddock, and hake, and cusk, and ling, and monk, and skate, and wolf, and tod, and eel, and pout, and ray, and plaice, and witchback, and blackback, and flounder, and eel. I mean, I could go on. There's 35 species in New England alone. And by the way, when you bake them in a spiced tomato sauce over brown rice almond pilaf, flecked with a little bit of cilantro, topped with a spicy olive oil, woo! Wait, what was the fish? It does not matter. You know exactly what that tastes like. As long as that fish is fresh and beautiful, wow, that dish is going to be great. So why are we not willing to make that fish the dogfish? I mean, we eat plenty of catfish, folks. What's the problem with dogfish, right? We're just not accustomed to eating it. And so what that's done is it's created a very irrational economy that acts unsustainably upon the fishermen. And oftentimes we think sustainability is the purpose and the responsibility only of the producer. But it's our responsibility to behave sustainably, to ask of the oceans what they're willing to provide and able, rather than only telling them what we're willing to eat. What if fishermen were able to make $4.50 off any fish they pulled out of the ocean? Not just on cod, and $2.95 on haddock, and $1.10 on pollock, and 12 cents on dogfish, and whiting. I can't even sell that for lobster bait. And hake, well, right now it's at Harbor Fish for $1.75. Fishermen are not making the money on this stuff. The ocean can provide it all. And so if we were simply willing to ask, okay, what do you got? It's not a new concept. It's called the catch of the day. We've gotten so far away from that that we've created an unsustainable economy that acts unsustainably upon an ecosystem. And unfortunately has driven sort of the denouement of our fisheries. The cod has collapsed, and yet whiting is abundant. Dogfish is as plentiful as it's ever been. Pollock is everywhere. I mean, we have alewives, and we have herring, we have all of these fish, dogfish that we could be eating, but we're not. And part of it is because we don't know anything about them. And so, I wrote you a little something about them. And so, in this, we have the opportunity to begin to just reverse the order of operations that we have with the oceans. First and foremost, for health, for environment, and for heritage reasons, we need to walk into a store and when we say, what's for dinner? Seafood. We need to just decide that. Twice a week, seafood. And then we go say, what's freshest, what's best? What do you got? And then understand that you already know how to cook it. Because if you know how to cook one fish, you basically know how to cook them all. They're categories of seafood. And when we understand it to be so, then we can begin to diversify in ways that really help both the economies and the environments. And in the end, we end up thriving. Why? Because you bought the freshest piece of fish in the store, and not just the one you were familiar with. Which means it was probably pretty fresh, which means it was probably even more delicious, which means you might actually be likely to go back and do it again. And we're creating a positive feedback loop of behaviors in which everybody begins to thrive. And all of this is simply due to us creating a very modest fluency in seafood, and to celebrate its stories. So I'd like to read to you a little bit from the book. So in addition to the photo essay, there's also just to show you how it's laid out a little bit. Most of it is writing. There's 200,000+ words in here, plus all these visuals ranging from our histories, from the Maine Maritime Museum, the National Fisherman Magazine, great collections we have here, tribal councils, local libraries from all over the country that we sourced from. It was actually just as much work sourcing all the images as it was the reading. Over 130,000 pages of research reading went into this. And a lot of it was very fun, a lot of it was very boring too. But from that, I've tried to create little character sketches of species, and I'll read to you a couple of them, if you'll allow me. So tilefish. Anybody heard of tilefish? As an executive chef, the first fish I typed onto my inaugural menu was tilefish. I've always been charmed by its tender but firm meat, resembling that of a striped bass, but having a wholly unique flavor. Its aroma is savory, admitting a buttermilk sour sweetness that foreshadows a complex but playful flavor that is as rich as a scallop and is often compared to lobster. Tilephishes have a very curious tale, even as fish tales go. The species were not known to science, let alone diners, until May 1879, when a Captain Kirby was trawling for cod in the waters southwest of Nantucket and was greatly surprised when he hauled aboard 5,000 pounds of an unknown and somewhat strange-looking fish. With haste, a fine specimen was sent below deck to the galley and prepared for a taste trial. All who ate the fish that day agreed that it had one of the finest constitutions and flavor of any fish they had previously had. Tilefish presently became abundant in East Coast markets, and as captains learned to fish them, setting their nets deeper than they had previously for cod, in the following years it quickly became the darling of cuisine, in much the same way more recent decades have witnessed Chilean sea bass and orange roughies suddenly positioned atop every menu. And here is where the story gets even more peculiar and mysterious. Not 3 years after its discovery, the fish completely disappeared. In March of 1882, merchant vessels crossing the Atlantic reported passing through vast shoals of dead tilefishes, obscuring the surface over areas ranging many square miles. Ships arriving to Boston, Philly, Washington, D.C. validated this calamity that spanned the entire Northeast and Mid-Atlantic coasts. The cause of this mass mortality was unknown, though it is now speculated that shifting currents trapped the fish in an inversion of cold water, extirpating them en masse. It wasn't until 1892, 10 years on, that we find a record that another tilefish was caught, and a few years again before its presence returned at market. By the time it was again available, consumers had forgotten, lost interest, or had discovered a new favorite, and tilefish has never again been as dominantly popular as it briefly was. In the decades following this disaster until modern time, the tilefish population has steadily increased, and with a few major dips along the way, now is once again subject of increasing culinary curiosity. All of the tilefish species are unique and beautiful in their appearance, though being somewhat oafish of face, they are sleek and well built. They are sometimes known as clown of the sea due to their colorful spotting and exaggerated, worried-looking eyes. This deepwater species displays casts of cerulean blue and olive green that can deviate into yellow, rose, sepia, and purple along their midline and down into their belly. All tilefishes claim a fine-grained, smooth texture and delicate flavor, reminiscent of the best characteristics of halibut, but with a gamey moxie of a striped bass. Evelyn Spencer, a great cookbook author of the early 20th century, states boldly, "Tilefish is a superior food in every way that is best when boiled or baked like cod. Its unique firmness makes it a good choice for stews or braises. This taut texture makes it a wonderful candidate for salt curing like cod. I find tilefishes, though, at their zenith when bathed in a dense brine before being slowly hot smoked and sliced very thin. The flavors of highly aromatic wood with a hint of spice, such as alder or cherry, provide the fish a perfect point of flattery. The skin is very thick, and though edible, the high heat needed to give it a pleasant texture is not in the best interest of the flesh. Tilefish's predominantly crustacean-based diet gives it a confident and charismatic flavor, and its personality pairs well with many cuisines. It is a relatively thick band of red muscle tissue or bloodline, and though this is as soft in flavor, it contrasts well with the ashen white flesh." And so from that, if you walk into a store, I hope you say tilefish. Yeah, I got this. Here we go. And it's that type of just familiarity, that general fluency. And we don't need to know everything. We don't need to remember Captain Kirby's name or May 1879, but rather just that one little hook that catches us. To be interested in that fish is so important. And every single species, nearly, has a little bit of story, has a little bit of history. Mackerel was once the most abundant, was once the most important and valuable food species in all of America. Bonito, the same. Another species called horse mackerel, though, was once left to just rot on the beach if it wasn't able to be sold as cat food. And horse mackerel has many other names: tunny, whitefish for some unknown reason, and more recently known as bluefin tuna, the most valuable species in all of the world. One specimen recently selling for more than $1 million for a single fish. But it wasn't until 1970s that we caught bluefish on purpose. I mean, think about Old Man in the Sea. If you're out there in a boat about the size of this screen, trying to catch a fish, and all of a sudden you catch a fish that is about the size of your boat, cut the line. And if you catch it, guess what? You have no way to cool it down, even bring it aboard the boat, so you leave it on the beach to rot. And it wasn't until the Japanese showed up in Gloucester Harbor in the 1970s and began saying, "I'll pay you 50 cents to $1 a pound for that fish," that the fishery even began. Sushi didn't exist in America. I mean, all of these things, we think bluefin tuna or tuna is just so much a part of our culture, but really it wasn't until very, very recently. The first sushi restaurant didn't open in America until 1981 in LA. And it was a few years after that that cosmopolitan areas had their own replications of it, and now you see Chinese, Korean, Japanese sushi restaurants in strip malls the world, the country over. Wow, what an incredible proliferation. But we don't often think back in the anthropology of that. Eulakin, another species of incredible fascination and incredible abundance. It was described by Lewis and Clark in their journals, sketched out, and described as the most delicious of all of their discoveries. It's also known as candlefish because it is so oily and rich that when dried, Native American populations used to do this and then light the tails, and they would literally burn down like candles for their oil. It is a fish that is so fatty that it can become feed in its own fat. You put the raw fish in a pan over low heat, and like bacon, they begin to render out until ultimately they are submerged in their own oil. slowly cooking to a custard-like texture that can be just peeled right off the bone for this incredible snack. The oil itself then served as a sauce, just drizzled over salmon like you would oil. Its flavor, not pungent or aromatic at all, but softly floral, violet-like, almost watermelon in its scent. Woo! Oh, by the way, and that fish will save your life if you eat it twice a week. This is pretty cool, right? And it's abundant. And Lewis and Clark even had it in their journal. I mean, the core of discovery. And what was the best thing they discovered? Eulakin. Have you ever heard that? No. This is part of our history that we should be mindful. Pacific salmon. When Captain Robert Gray sailed into the Columbia River in 1803, he found there what native populations had known for 10,000 years, that it was the greatest abundance of salmon on the planet, that had sustained communities for literally eons. And from the waters of the Pacific Northwest, when we think of the Pacific Northwest and our expansion there, what do we think of? 1849, the Klondike, the gold rush, right? Yeah, well, it was actually salmon. That was the value. Exponentially more money has been mined from the rivers and oceans of the Pacific Northwest in salmon than was ever found in gold. And that value continues. And it's our opportunity to sustain that. We have areas of the world like Bristol Bay, Alaska, where 80 million sockeye salmon a year swim back into those waters. That's, we have a strategic oil reserve. We should have a strategic salmon reserve. It's right there. It's the healthiest food we have access to, and we have the world's greatest abundance of it. Wow, pretty cool. Unfortunately, on the Columbia, well, we dammed ourselves there. And by dammed ourselves, I mean we actually dammed the river 13 times and kind of cut off that abundance, sort of segregating and sort of eviscerating the skeletal structure of the salmon's livelihood and lifespan. But we have this wild abundance still. It's still with us, and we should celebrate this. And if you'll allow me now to read again from the book about bluefish, everybody's least favorite fish. The bluefish is a curiosity in the canon of American seafood cuisine. For centuries, it was considered amongst the most important, most appreciated, and most valued of all fish, keeping company with mackerel and pompano in the highest culinary echelon. In more recent times, bluefish has gone from being a fish that fed millions to a hugely popular recreational fishery that largely ignores its qualities at the table. I've had guests in restaurants belittle me for daring to serve them fertilizer. Oh, I go out and catch dozens at a time, one guest said to me with likely no exaggeration, and it's only good for tilling into the yard. Such a response illustrates the ignorance that surrounds this august fish. The mysterious bluefish has been prone to periods of extreme abundance followed by spells of near total absence. Early colonial histories account bluefish being extremely abundant, but by 1764 they had totally disappeared, and mention of them in texts ceased. It was not until 1810, nearly 50 years on, that a few fish began to show up again. In 1817, their numbers increasing, and by 1825, again abundant, peaking in 1841 when massive shoals darkened the waters along the Jersey coast. There's not much scientific consensus about why this happens, but the historical evidence validates bluefish's cryptic singularity. When abundant, they have been a blessing for the poor, as they have been easily caught near shore. In the hard years during the Depression, the Long Island Railroad ran, quote, fishermen's specials trains out to Montauk, returning at day's end with men's and sacks of bluefish packed together as tight as sardines in a can. You can imagine what that smelled like on Monday. As recently as the 1990s, bluefish provided important sustenance for many poor families in the mid-Atlantic and New York regions. These are transient fish, with migration patterns that span the entire Atlantic coast. They congregate in schools of incredible size, once recounted as covering an area equal to 10,000 football fields. Within schools, the fish are roughly of similar size, a good idea, as the famously voracious blues are cannibalistic, so they figured it's best to stay away from larger kin. Baby bluefish, just about a year in age, are known as tailors or choppers. Juveniles earn the name snappers, as when in the deranged fury of a feeding frenzy, their jaws click with the sounds of castanets. As they grow larger, about 3 to 5, the name harbor blues, or the less flattering rats, applies. Large blues, weighing 10 pounds or out, are hereon known as horse blues. Despite being the only member of its family and its historically esteemed presence in our cuisine, it's also known by myriad regional and colloquial names. Yellow mackerel, horse mackerel, skipjack, greenfish, snapping mackerel, blue snapper, skip mackerel, all basically just weird variations. And for reasons that I cannot conceive of, when caught in the Hudson River above New York City, they are known as whitefish. But call them, sir, quote, by whatever name you please, they are all the same Pomomatrix saltatrix still, and deal out destruction and death to other species in all localities they visit, said the Honorable N.E. Atwood, representative of the Cape District in 1870, in official testimony to describe the calamitous personality of these fish. They have been likened to animated chopping machines, no deeper purpose than to cut or otherwise destroy as many fish as possible. Of all the fish in the ocean, it seems somewhat incongruous, then, that the bluefish, with all of its vicious vice, should be the subject of such romantic and rapturous writing. There are marvelous poems in honor of this sage green, sea blue, white-bellied, stub-nosed fish. Of one of the most beautiful books ever written about man's relationship with the sea, Blues, by John Hersey. In it, he explores our place in this world through our pursuit of food. The narrative confesses sacred reverence for the vigor and immense power of bluefish, which he describes as, quote, possessed of pin-sharp teeth and murderous little underslung jaws. As they corral prey, the conflict tempestuously boils the waters in what's known as a bluefish blitz. The sea turns a frothy red as bluefish busy themselves, chopping and consuming anything to fit between their jaws. Viscous oil stains map the geography of the killing. Once upon a school of prey such as menhaden, it is in their nature to be so covetous of any fish left alive that even when fully satiated, the bluefish will disgorge themselves in order to continue killing. Not even sharks, in their most hysteric frenzy, come close to the blind and frantic energy that Hersey describes when the blues strike like blacksmith's hammers. Despite their pleasant name, these violent vandals are as lurid in demeanor as they are siren in savor. At their peak, bluefish landed well over 120 million pounds per year, though just 10% of this product was of commercial fishery. Blues have always been an important species for the recreational industry, second only to the striped bass, with which it is commonly found. Unfortunately, blues are sought mostly for thrill, and are landed without much regard for the quality of meat. For bluefish to reflect its true potential, it must be immediately bled, flushed with salt water, and eviscerated then iced. Only such care will proffer fillets having any chance to impress on the plate. I think too many people first experience bluefish as the result of a long day's derby, dozens of fish landed not properly tended to before being relegated to a freezer, or unenthusiastically cooked by a fisherman whose ambitions were for a striped bass dinner. Given such an experience, I sympathize with the distrusting gentleman in my restaurant who thought I was once selling him a bluefish, as a tailor once sold an emperor new clothes. Fish are fun. Fish have personality. Fish have character. And fish have personality. They have qualities worth us discovering. So ultimately, I ask you to simply eat more seafood, to celebrate our heritage, to think about that farm in your head, those undulating rows of corn, those autumn splendors setting the sun, those hills. Think of our presence on the land as beautiful, and to think of our presence on the sea as beautiful. Unfortunately, when we think about that farm, we appreciate our presence there, but we think the ocean beautiful for our absence there. And so when we think about our future, we need to think about expanding into a new economic geography of supporting and sustaining wild capture heritage fisheries, and of moving into a world of aquaculture, where especially here in Maine, we can begin to create new opportunity that celebrates our heritage, that sustains environments, and that sustains us. And so with that, I will end. Thank you very much.